Welcome to Socializing Security, where every week we have a discussion about security, compliance, and beyond.
Our goal is to learn and grow by socializing each week's topic with each other, our guests, and with you.
A quick compliance note, this podcast is meant for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or regulatory advice.
We're glad you've joined us, and we hope you'll learn along with us.
All right, welcome back everyone to another episode of Socializing Security. Hey Brian, how are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Milou. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. I think you and I are both still very much in that season of things being a little hectic and trying to still prioritize fun things alongside work. And so it's just like a busy time of year.
Yeah. Hopefully things settle down a little bit, but I've said that before in life and it never happens. So I don't expect
it just keeps
it to
getting busier, I think. So,
yeah.
But looking forward to our discussion today, we're going to be pivoting to privacy. So we haven't really touched on a privacy specific episode yet. We've talked a lot about privacy, especially when we've been interviewing our guests. If you haven't checked out some of our previous interview episodes, we try to tie them together by asking our guests the same question towards the end of their interview episode, which is really, do they believe that the fight for privacy is dead? And is it now really the fight for security? And today, I think we're going to talk about a couple of different example scenarios where some relatively recent news events, some of them from last year, so not like super hot off the presses, but still very important and worth a discussion around privacy practices. And just going to talk today a little bit more casually about our initial intakes on some of these concerns and what potentially you could do for best practices for some of these. And one of the ones we're going to talk about, there's really nothing you can do. So we'll get into that. But
positive as always, aren't we?
Yeah, there's only so much you can do as a data subject. So it's just being mindful, but awareness of your privacy practices and starting to ask for better privacy protections is huge. And I think that's where we're seeing a lot of the industry is pushing, where we're seeing a lot of regulators come out with new privacy, especially in like children's privacy and online security privacy. We're seeing a lot of push in the regulations at the moment here in I guess Q3 2024 at the moment. So depending when you're listening in, but so yeah. I'm happy to just kind of give a high level overview of the first scenario. And Brian, I think I'll give it to you and then I'll get some of your baseline impressions kind of. So Mozilla Foundation reported back in 2023 they did an analysis of car privacy practices. So when we're thinking about purchasing a car, I personally, as somebody who works in privacy, I actually would never really think about the privacy concerns related to purchasing a car. I don't think that's something that I would necessarily put in my thoughts as opposed to like mileage and whether or not I want an electric or a gas vehicle. But they ended up doing a privacy analysis by reviewing all of the data intake potentially for like connected applications. So if you have like a newer car, you might actually have an application tied to your phone associated with your car usage. Obviously, you can have integrations with your listening platforms. So, your podcast or music platforms that you're listening to for app usage. And then also just thinking through actual privacy policies for these companies. So Mozilla did an analysis. I think they said that this was one of the most in-depth ones, that they spent more time than they normally would when they're doing product privacy reviews to just look at what car manufacturers are processing. And unfortunately, I think they received like the worst scores they've potentially ever given on a product review based off of privacy. So they looked at 25 different brands and basically said that they were all bad.
Yeah, I've bought a car in the last couple of years, and it's kind of my first connected car, if you will, smart car. Like the whole concept of having an app on my phone for my car is still super duper weird for me. And I did think about the privacy aspect of it, but not too much, just because I'm a bit worn out of thinking about privacy, and every single decision I make has a privacy angle to it. And that is causing some real cognitive exhaustion for me, having to constantly think about it and almost getting to the point of not really, I don't want to say I don't care, but sometimes you don't have a choice. Like, you just have to accept it and move on. And I felt a little bit like that in this situation. It's still sad to see how bad this really is, because next to your home, as far as safety concerns go, like, I feel safe in my home because this is my home. This is my fortress. This is my shelter. The car is kind of the next thing there, because it is something that you use almost on a daily basis, at least here in the US. And to see news like this, it's like, oh wow, they're watching us. To me, being the cynic that I am, they're taking advantage of the fact that most people don't think about privacy and car in the same sentence. And therefore, like, nobody's going to pay attention to us. Let's make what we can off of it while we can. And that's really sad. It's very cynical of me. But I also recognize the fact that it's cynical, and I'm still okay with it because I really do think that it works that way sometimes. Now, that all being said, having this kind of attention on it is important. And this is where regulations get into place. This is where, we talked on a previous episode about kind of EU regulations pushing stuff forward and being much more consumer minded than we get in most other jurisdictions. This kind of attention really pushes those things forward. And I'm really excited to see more of that kind of protection for consumers to be, their privacy to be protected, because the whole conversation or the multiple conversations we've had on privacy versus security, I don't believe the fight for privacy is dead myself, but I do believe that we're losing that battle very, very, very quickly. I think there's still time to pull up out of that nosedive. I think for future generations, it's important that we do that and not give up at this point, because while my privacy may be ruined, all of my data and my information may be out there between situations like this where they sell my data and supposedly make it anonymous, but it can be aggregated and figured out pretty easily. And you throw in that all of the data dumps they get from cybersecurity incidents. It's a lot of my information's out there. But if we can solve these problems today, my kids may not have to deal with that, and their kids almost definitely won't have to deal with it, because by the time they have data to collect and use against them, hopefully we've plugged all the holes. I am a believer that we can't give up on it. We've got to try and plug those holes. We got to do something about it, because otherwise, we wouldn't have privacy. You can't uniquely identify. You can't have a credit card. You can't have any of these things. So I don't think the fight is dead. I think we're sliding down rather than climbing up the hill at this point. But we need to stop that bleed and start fixing and filling those holes, to mix so many metaphors.
What I think is good about what Mozilla is trying to achieve in this one, right, is just raising awareness. So the first thing is like, it's probably not something a lot of consumers have thought of in the first place. And no one's really holding car companies accountable, right? I can't think of a regulatory action I've seen against any of these large brand manufacturers that they were looking at specifically for privacy concerns, right? We're very used to seeing social media giants in the news very regularly for violating data subject privacy, consumer privacy rights. Again, maybe there is one, but I haven't seen one that's made like major headline news for like a car manufacturer being like, hey, this is really problematic. In the article, and we'll make sure to link it in the show notes, is that Kia, and I'm specifically calling them out because they're called out in this article. Normally, we're not in the business of calling out brands, but Kia specifically mentions in their privacy policy that they can collect information about your sex life. And there were other car manufacturers that also said that they would be collecting genetic information, which potentially is related to the app, that there's potentially processing biometric data from like app logins, depending on your device policies. But the fact that Kia is coming out and saying that they're processing data related to your sex life is very odd and has nothing to do with the product that you're purchasing. As opposed to maybe if you're thinking about like a wearable device where people are potentially using like an Oura ring or something to potentially track like their cycle or something like that, maybe then there's like more nexus between those data. But like thinking about purchasing a car and then Kia manufacturing having access to your sex life data is just probably just not reasonable. From like no reasonable person would anticipate that company should be processing that level of data.
Yeah, I would assume that comes from, because I know in other situations, like the whole thing with Facebook and the data they're collecting and how they allowed people to buy that data, was the fact that like people were able to figure out that people were cheating on their spouses by watching, their geolocation. And obviously cars are big on the geolocation piece of things these days. And I'm assuming that there's inferences in there that they wanted to make sure that legally they were like, yeah, you can infer that based on this data. Therefore, let's make sure that that's outside of our liability if somebody were to find something like that. So there are real world consequences to the amount of data that one device can collect about you. And it is a little scary. I definitely rethink Google Maps tracking me everywhere I go and what that data can really mean.
I think we've talked about this before, that my husband, like, will, if we ever have an argument of like whether we've been to a restaurant or that when the last time we visit, right? Like
Yeah.
he has opted into pretty much everything. So like they can like tell him how many times he's been to a specific restaurant and when the dates we visited and stuff. And that's like, to me, it's too far. He likes it because sometimes he'll win an argument based off of that data collection piece. So yeah, again, everybody's individual response is different. And I think we can kind of use this as pivoting to the next conversation that we want to have. Obviously, we'll share the article. Maybe we do need to start considering privacy when we're thinking about car manufacturing. I guess I would say I don't really have a best practice because they basically were like, none of them are great. So there wasn't one that they were like, hey, if you really want to go buy XYZ car, like they're good on privacy. They pretty much said that they were all pretty terrible. Some of them even were to the extent that like your car potentially won't work if you want to opt out of certain functionality. They didn't really give end users a lot of options to exercise their privacy rights.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is a trend we also see with TVs. So, the advice there that most people give is buy a dumb TV. Don't buy a smart TV because of their ability to track and do things, and then, quite frankly, hacker ability on some of those. Go buy a used car. It's better for the environment if you buy a used car, assuming it's in good working order and you can keep it running. If you're worried about the privacy aspect of things.
So yeah, if we're pivoting and we're starting to think about different levels of data and maybe also use cases that we haven't necessarily like thought through about what type of data we're being processing. I know in the US, for example, like TSA has been using facial recognition scanning for a couple of years now. And I know you can technically, if you want, you can object to that. You don't have to automatically opt in, but there's convenience to it, right? It makes your like check-in procedure just quicker. So I think a lot of people have already opted in. And again, law enforcement probably already has that information anyways. That being said, there was an article that came out in February of 2024 related to Vietnam. And we're talking now about a government starting to process collecting biometric data, including DNA, and associating that with their like driver's licenses and user identification cards. And that to me is a very different level. And what's interesting is also the age requirements. So it's basically anyone over the age of 14. And then you actually can opt into it for children the ages between 6 and 14. So there is also child data that they're collecting as a part of this new wave of biometric government identification.
That's kind of wild reading about that one just because it is so much more invasive than what we're used to anybody doing, really. I mean, this is a level beyond most places. I think we've talked about the DNA collection aspect of things and the companies that do kind of your family tree analysis based on that. And I love genealogy. That's one of my passions, not one I do much these days, but have done in the past. And the ability to use those DNA records to find my family tree is pretty intriguing to me, but I've been hesitant to do it because I just don't, the implications of it are so huge. I mean, if my DNA is completely mapped, there's theoretically somebody someday could go and clone me and create a new version of me out there. If you want to take it to an absurd, but not necessarily out of the realm of possibility place, those kind of things can happen. And then you throw in all the things about, okay, well, if the insurance company gets a hold of that and they find out that I'm predisposed to some sort of disease that'll take me out in my 50s, then, they'll give me a life insurance policy to 50, but man, I'm going to pay out the nose to get anything beyond that. Those types of things are not the way that we structured those types of things, and therefore feel very invasive and very counterproductive to the reasons why we've done them up to this point. So having a country do it at this level, I see where they're going with that. Like if you want to track citizenry, if you want to avoid fake IDs, if you want to make sure that like, hey, if I want to go vote, instead of having to show an ID or whatever, I just have to scan my fingerprint or a facial recognition or give them a drop of blood, whatever that might be. Yeah, I can see the value of that from the company's or from the country's perspective, but this really becomes a convenience versus privacy conversation that I don't remember on that article if that was something that came up through a legislative body or if that was something that an executive body put down and essentially mandated. But that's one of those things like, I sure hope the people had a voice in that, because at least there was a majority that would have chosen that, whether or not they truly understood the consequences or not is another story.
It was passed in a law back in November of 2023. So I'm not super familiar with the Vietnamese government structure. So I'm not sure exactly how that would have passed, but it is codified in law. So it is definitely has legal standing. Yeah. What I think is interesting about it is I think it goes specifically when we're talking about like the genealogy example and thinking about the intention versus the reality of the situation, where I think if the government's true intention is to just like have better verification procedures to potentially, again, make certain things more convenient for their citizens, I'm sure the intention behind this, I hope, is very positive. I am concerned about what the reality is, where this, especially if this information got brought into the wrong hands, then this could have very serious consequences for their citizens. And especially this is now data that they're, being entrusted with and probably haven't had access to before, except potentially for like in their criminal database or something like that. Right.
Yeah.
So, I think fingerprints is probably something that like most of our fingerprints are within a government database and body. That's not like a very surprising data set. I think it's the iris scans, blood, potentially samples, and DNA samples is starting to get to a level that the government probably necessarily hasn't had voluntary access from their citizens. Maybe they got it through ancestry type software company that is then sharing that data with government bodies. That has happened. So, it's probably data sets that the government has had access to through other means. I think this is just a little bit different, where it's a voluntary collection from the citizens themselves and it's put in through law. So I would be very curious about what are the additional security protections that the government has put in place to better secure and protect that data, because if it got into the wrong hands, it could be significantly detrimental to their citizens.
Yeah. And this is one of those that as we look at is it a privacy or security battle at this point, to some level, they've lost the privacy battle even further there. Again, I won't say it's lost, but the battle for making sure that government protects that data with the current rate of cybercrime is mind-boggling, to maybe put it nicely. Like, that is a rich data set for somebody to go after. And, we're living in a realm of, if it's a good enough data set and you get enough motivated hackers or nation states, they're going for it. And it's only a matter of time before that gets breached and all that data gets into somebody's hands, whether it'll show up on the dark web in a leak site or it'll be used in some way against that citizenry remains to be seen. But that data is going to get out. And, at that point, a huge chunk of the privacy battle will have been lost for the citizens of Vietnam that opt into it. So it's unfortunate. I hope it goes well, as we do with all these types of situations, but it's dicier than I would like to see it, to be honest.
Yeah, I'm curious if it's also something that they will enforce eventually, like to the point if people haven't opted in, if eventually their ID card will no longer be valid because they aren't like to the level of verification as some of their other like people that opted in earlier. I would be curious to learn more about that. Is this truly voluntary, or is it something that eventually they're going to enforce across everybody to have
like the Real ID here in the US, where
yeah, exactly.
It should have gone into play 5 years ago, but now it's 5 years from now, maybe.
Oh, really?
No, not that far out, but they keep kicking the can down the road 1 or 2 years every year or two, it feels like. So
got it. Well, yeah. And then I guess one of the other areas we wanted to kind of touch on today was, and I think we can speak about this one a little bit more broadly, but I think we've all had the experience, right, where we've been talking to someone about something and then suddenly something comes up on your phone. And then you're like, oh my God, my phone is listening to me. And that's not exactly how it works, but targeting advertisement is very real and super normal in our day-to-day. I think that's something that we have all experienced firsthand, where we, again, have maybe said something to someone, maybe they looked something up, we looked something up, or, pinged somebody's Wi-Fi and suddenly we're seeing what their toothpaste recommendations are, is something that is a very real privacy concern for all of us today. I think targeting advertising can have some really intense consequences for consumers. It can be very influential. It can also lead to the spread of misinformation. So this is definitely something that is a larger topic. But I think we had seen an article recently where a lawyer basically came out and said that she believed like her library reading materials were being reflected in her mobile ads, where basically like she was accessing like books from a public library through like an e-platform for ebooks, and then suddenly started seeing ads for the books that she was like trying to get through her public library in her targeted ads. And it started to then turn into a privacy discussion related to the library's data sharing policies and what are they sharing with third parties.
This was another one that really highlighted for me with how risky the data we put out there can really be, because that intersectionality of data, if I can get the right information from here and the right information from here and the right, it's essentially for those of us in the database space, being able to normalize a database and say, with the right connectors, I can connect some disparate pieces of data and recombine them into one thing. And it gives a lot more flexibility, a lot more efficiencies in that regard. And so being able to do these types of things, and yeah, I've had that experience. I'm like, why all of a sudden am I getting an ad for this thing? And sometimes it's obvious because you search for one thing on Amazon and all of a sudden your Amazon, the ads for Amazon that Amazon is putting out there for you in a completely different app is very targeted based on that. And that's weird, but I can see how that's happening. At least it's, somehow Amazon is connecting me on Amazon and me in this game together and being able to show me those ads. I can see how that happens now. That's not really all that difficult of a thing to do anymore. Third-party cookies is a big part of the explanation in some of these cases too, to be able to, just decline those people. You don't need third-party ads. There's very few sites that break without them, and you can turn them on for those sites. That's real advice for me on this one. But yeah, that experience of seeing something like that just like not many people have talked about that. And even with this one, it was audiobooks from a public library was the situation here. What application are you using to listen to them? Like if it's a third-party app, maybe they're collecting that information. I don't know that this is a real thing, but maybe the Bluetooth headphones you're using are somehow collecting through the app on your phone that connects to those Bluetooth headphones is collecting that information because it can see what's streaming through there. And now all of a sudden knows that you're listening to that specific genre, that specific topic. And now all of a sudden you're getting ads for, related to Stephen King or whatever. Those types of things can be connected way easier than we all can appreciate, I think. And rightfully, you should be freaked out when you see things like that. Like, don't let those things go without freaking you out. Don't become used to that. More real advice, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, I think when we're thinking about larger platforms, right? Like Google, for example, and Meta and most of the social media sites actually give you the option to opt out of targeting advertising. So I know that there's been large pushes for some of these larger platforms to making sure that they do actually give consumers additional privacy consent policies to basically be able to opt in to being like, I don't want you to be analyzing my shopping data and then suddenly pushing all of the same ads. So you can definitely explore that. I will say on some of the smaller platforms, that's a functionality that's lacking. So yes, checking and denying, don't automatically accept all for the cookie consent. If there's a banner there and it lets you just like only opt into the necessary ones, it's probably the better thing to do on a regular basis, as opposed to just going for convenience and hitting accept all. Take a couple seconds and maybe just like deny, and only do the strictly necessary ones that you need to actually be able to like process the content you're trying to look for. And then just being mindful of, again, how those apps are connected and what you're sharing. A lot of this, unfortunately, is out of our hands. So I think this whole article started as like, how is this even happening in the first place? Like this is was more of like an expose on like, how are these things connected, as opposed to like, I'm very aware that this third party is sharing this information to this. And we'll see the data sharing will get better over the next couple of years. There's some regulatory changes coming out that we're going to see some better consent practices with sharing with like affiliate and marketing information. But we'll see if that makes it clearer. But I would say for the most part, like from our recommendation perspective is like, look at your cookies, don't necessarily automatically accept all, potentially create that as a habit. And then take the time to actually look at your target advertising, especially on social media and like Google and everything. Cause it can also be interesting because you can also just like learn some things about your habits online. And then you can also opt out of some of those things if you don't want that.
Yeah. I noticed a big box store that I shop at sent me a notification the other day that they were updating their privacy policy. And the nature of that really was that with all the new privacy laws that are out there, that they were adjusting things. And so part of that adjustment was that, yeah, you can opt out of them selling your data, but you have to do that on every single device. And it's based on a cookie. So if that cookie gets wiped out, if you say clear my cache, clear all my data, or you're using an incognito type browser, those types of things are, you're going to have to redo every single time. So be mindful of where you're opting out, because that locality matters as far as device and account go.
Interesting.
Yeah. It pays to read them.
Well, we'll try to do some pivots to privacy a little bit more often, where we just talk about some of the other like hot topics related to privacy that we're seeing that we just also find interesting. I think these 3 articles I thought were particularly interesting because they were, one, hadn't thought about cars and privacy. Apparently we might need to be keeping an eye out for which ones are better in the future, but something to think about when you're car buying, and be mindful of when you're automatically downloading your apps, and then thinking through, what do I feel comfortable with sharing with platforms, providers, government agencies if they're asking for different levels of data, seeing if you can opt out if it is available to you.
Yep, for sure.
Play the game. We play the game of how little information can I provide to get the thing that I need. That's the game that I play now.
Yeah, same here. It's a scary world out there, but we're here to help everybody through if we can.
All right. Well, Thanks for socializing with us today. We appreciate it. And we'll see you on the next episode.
Yep. Take care, everybody.
Bye.
Bye. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Socializing Security. We hope you learned a thing or two with us.
If you'd like to continue socializing with us on this topic or have feedback, we'd love to hear from you on LinkedIn or social media. Just search for Socializing Security. Or you can email us at info@socializingsecurity.com.
Until next time, stay social and stay secure.